Hey guys, welcome to the fourth video and final video for chapter 35. And for this one, we're going to be talking about fascism. Two different versions of it, really. You know, kind of the original version that emerged in Italy. So we'll be talking about Italian fascism. And then a similar fascist style movement that emerged in Germany, but obviously took on its own identity and became in many ways much more well known than Italian fascism. And I'm referring to Nazism. All right, so first let's talk about fascism itself. Fascism is a little bit of a tricky thing to define. The word itself is derived from the word fasces. Fasces were a bundle of rods or sticks around an axe, and they were a symbol of authority in ancient Rome. You know, why they chose a bundle of sticks around an axe, I honestly don't know. But, you know, when Mussolini came up with the word, he wanted to make that connection back to ancient Rome. And so, you know, fasces was the symbol that he chose. So that's where the word itself comes from. But what makes it a little difficult to truly kind of define is that there's never been a single written ideological rule set. Right? Marx wrote a rule book for communism. Democracy has been written about over and over again over the years. You don't really have that for fascism. It's more a collection of ideas about nationhood and power, and in Nazis' case, race as well, racial superiority. In any event, here are the few of the big kind of ideas that we'll be discussing. One is prioritizing the state over the individual. Right? That's a major aspect of it. Civil liberties are secondary in fascism. Order, strength of the government, that's what's important. So freedom of the press, freedom of speech, that's out of there. Okay. Another one, intense nationalism. Here you see Mussolini speaking to one of these huge rallies that became popular during that time. And, you know, the same thing with the rallies in Nazi Germany as well, you know, kind of whipping up the public into a frenzy. It uses the belief that society is in crisis to its advantage. It kind of plays upon this victimization identity that a lot of the people feel at this time. It spread its message that the hardships faced by the people can be solved if they unite in a strong national group. Now, this group can be political, but not always. It can also be racial or ethnic as well, and that we're especially going to talk about that in Nazi Germany. Now, sometimes this nationalism can be very belligerent, you know, belligerent meaning kind of going out and picking a fight. And this can often lead to xenophobia or fear of foreigners. Now, all of this can be very dangerous when it's paired with militarism. Militarism is a glorifying of the role of the military. Move me up here a little bit so you can see. Here, and a lot of times it's from a very young age, whether that was the Hitler Youths in Germany or here you have, Italian military leaders kind of going through a youth military organization. But it's this glorifying the role of the military and trying to get everybody to participate in it. But when you glorify it, you also want to use your military. And this can be a dangerous thing. So nationalism, militarism, and xenophobia, they usually result in a nation attacking other nations. Now, the popularity of fascism increases in the 1920s and 30s in Europe, especially in middle class and rural populations of struggling countries. These people, they weren't attracted to Marx's call for the proletariat to rise up. They weren't the working class of the cities, but they were angry at how weak their countries were in Italy and Germany. All right, so let's talk about Italian fascism. Let's move me back down here. Italian fascism begins because a lot of Italians were angry at how Italy was treated by the Allies at the end of World War I at the Paris Peace Conference. There was the view also that the government was weak, and this was further compounded by widespread economic collapse, and that was evidenced by the mass migration of Italians to the U.S. in the years after World War I. So into this very combustible environment steps Benito Mussolini. Now, Mussolini actually started out as a socialist before World War I, but he abandoned it after the war and started a program that encouraged nationalism that sometimes turned violent. In 1919, he called his group supporters the Italian Fascist Party, and the word fascism was born, obviously. Mussolini and the fascists quickly gained support. Especially popular were the black shirts, and they were called that because they wore black shirts. Nothing really complex there. They were militant squads, and they would target socialists in particular. Now, socialists were blamed by a lot of Italians for the economic problems, and so violence against them was welcomed, actually, by a lot of Italians. Now, their support in Mussolini's rise to power, they culminate in the March on Rome. Thousands and thousands of black shirts. You guys can see it enough there, okay, to get the idea. You see even some of the ancient Roman ruins in the background there. But you could see how they're moving from just kind of like militia into actually military style about this. They're marching as if they are an actual army. But they converge on the capital. And the Italian king, Victor Emmanuel, he knew that using the real Italian military against the black shirts would result in a public outcry. So he had no choice but to put Mussolini in position of power, and he made him prime minister in 1922. So this new fascist state, it transforms Italian society. By 1926, it had become a one-party state with Mussolini ruling as dictator. He became known as Il Duce, the Duke. And during this time, civil liberties were outlawed, right? Freedom of speech, no good. Thousands of Italians were jailed or executed by military courts. And being fascist, he also moved to crush labor unions, and he also prohibited strikes. Racism, anti-Semitism, they were actually never really a big thing with Italian fascism until the late 1930s. And what changed here was an alliance Mussolini made that would have major implications for both Europe and the world. And that alliance was with Nazi Germany. So Nazi Germany starts and is really synonymous with one man. Okay, and I'm sure everyone knows who I'm referring to, and that's Adolf Hitler. Hitler was born in Austria, and he studied to be an artist, but he was not very successful. And while living in Vienna, he became obsessed with German culture, right? The operas of Richard Wagner and German literature, and really kind of considered that to be the high point of European culture and really world culture. He also began adopting a racial ideology that put Germans, or Aryans, as he started to call them, supreme, at the top of everything. He developed a deep hatred for both Jews and Marxists, as well as for liberalism and democracy, which he viewed as weak. He served in the German army in World War I and served admirably, was wounded when Germany finally surrendered, or, the armistice, the ceasefire. And he became very, very angry and disenchanted after Germany's loss. He became determined to avenge Germany's humiliation, especially after the Treaty of Versailles, and make them back into the world powers he believed that they should be. His rise to power began with an obscure political party known as the National Socialist German Workers' Party, better known as the Nazi Party. Now, what's ironic is that the Nazi Party is not socialist at all, okay? So please don't get confused about that. In fact, as I said before, Hitler bore a deep hatred of socialism and communism. It had the word socialist because the people who founded it prior to Hitler joining it, okay, he did not start the Nazi Party. They wanted to appeal to a certain demographic of workers, but please don't get confused and think that Nazism and communism are the same thing. They both result in totalitarian dictatorships, yes, but they're on opposite ends of the political spectrum. Okay, Nazism and fascism is an extreme right-wing ideology. Communism is an extreme left-wing ideology. So please make sure that you remember that distinction. Now, Hitler's rise to power was bumpy. It kind of starts off really on the wrong foot. In 1923, he and his, at the time, small group of followers, they made their first major public appearance by making a symbolic overthrow of the government, by demonstrating in a beer hall in Munich. The revolt was quickly broken up and Hitler was jailed. And while in jail, he wrote his manifesto, Mein Kampf, all right, meaning my struggle. And in it, he outlined his views on nationalism and race. Okay, and the racial views are especially going to be important. And this would later be the guidebook for Nazi ideology, and it was actually the second most published book in Germany after the Bible in the 1930s. So after his release from prison, his popularity started to grow, and this was mostly due to anger at the Weimar government. The Weimar government was the democratic government put in place after World War I. And it was blamed for the humiliating Treaty of Versailles. Remember, Germany had to take the blame for the war. They lost their colonies, and they had to pay huge reparations. Germany's economy was a disaster. Inflation was making paper money practically worthless. These kids are playing with stacks of money. That's how worthless it was. You wouldn't even use it to go and buy bread, so kids are just using it as building blocks. People were using it as fire kindling and things like that. So many viewed the Weimar government as weak and incapable of solving their problems. And remember, Hitler associated democracy with weakness, and the Weimar government being a democratic government, he kind of pounced on that. Hitler promised that he could, kind of return Germany to greatness and solve all of the problems for Germany. his message, it appealed especially to lower middle class people. They were ruined by the economy, right? Shop owners, small business owners, people like that. And they were very angry at how their country was in ruin. So the Nazi Party began getting more of its members elected to the German parliament. And in 1933, Hitler was named Chancellor, or Prime Minister of Germany. And he wasted little time in transforming Germany into the Third Reich, or Third German Empire, right? The word Reich over here means empire in German. It was the third one after the Holy Roman Empire of the medieval era, and then the German Empire of the late 1800s into World War I. And he claimed it would last 1,000 years. So, like in Italy, Hitler outlawed other political parties, especially communists and socialists, right? They went after them hard. And he limited civil liberties significantly. Trade unions were outlawed, strikes were banned. Germany essentially became a police state where anyone who spoke out against the government was removed. So only a year after being named chancellor, Hitler, really he was now known as Der Führer, right, or the leader. Germany had become a totalitarian dictatorship with Hitler in firm control. Okay, you see these rallies that they were known for with the symbolism, it looked like something out of ancient Rome. And you see Hitler here front and center. He never wore a crown or anything like that, but he was very much the center of everything that happened. Created this cult of personality out of him. He took on almost a godlike status among the German people. Now, a lot of his appeal to the lower class was his message of Aryan superiority, right? So Germany emerges as a state with a very distinct racial hierarchy as well. Okay, so first, we'll talk about Aryan superiority. Once in control, the Nazis put the idea of racial superiority into practice. Aryans were put on top. He wanted Hitler wanted a race-based society, where this was kind of their classic image. Tall, strong, blonde hair, blue-eyed Germans, right? That was what he kind of associated with being, this Aryan supremacy and so forth. And they started to actually take very, very specific concerted steps to create a master race, such as eugenics. Now, eugenics is the science of improving populations by controlling breeding. Think what we saw the ancient Spartans do with babies who were born sickly or lame so they couldn't be warriors, right? Throw them off a cliff. So the Nazis started a policy of kind of, determining people according to their physical attributes, right? They measured noses and things like that. And they would also sterilize, meaning that, make it so that people couldn't reproduce anymore. Men and women who were and deemed unfit, they would sterilize. Now, these were mostly mentally unhealthy individuals, but even, people who were deaf, blind, even alcoholics were targeted for this. Abortions were officially illegal in Germany because the Nazis wanted women to have as many good Aryan blonde babies as possible, but the government imposed them on women who had mental health issues or if the baby was deemed racially unfit. Now, the physically and mentally handicapped, anyone deemed useless to society, they were eventually euthanized, which is a nice way of saying executed. Probably the best known feature of Nazi racial views, though, was anti-Semitism, discrimination against Jews. Jews became Hitler's go-to scapegoat for the problems of Germany. Anti-Semitism was nothing new in Germany, but Hitler ramped it up to be the official state policy. Being a Jew was viewed not as a religion, but as a race, and an inferior race. The Nazi plan to eliminate Jews in Europe didn't happen overnight. It was a step-by-step process, and the first step was the passing of laws like the Nuremberg laws. Now, these laws stripped German Jews of their citizenship, okay? It made it so they created a system of knowing, what would be a Jew according to their genealogy. Remember, it was race. It wasn't about, converting to a religion or anything like that. So it was illegal for you to marry non-Jews. It stripped them of their jobs, of their property. Jews couldn't work in government. They couldn't practice law. They couldn't serve as doctors to non-Jews. And before deciding on extermination, the Nazis at first wanted Jews to leave, so they tried to drive them out. The most notorious of these efforts was Kristallnacht, meaning the night of broken glass. Let me move me out of the way. I'm getting very short on time, so I got to kind of rush through the last minute here or so. In November 1938, Nazis encouraged and supported Germans to attack Jewish homes, to attack Jewish businesses and synagogues. Okay, they smashed windows. That Jews were killed and lynched as well. And obviously synagogues were burned to the ground. Many Jews viewed this as a sign of worse things to come, and over 250,000 Jews left Germany. Most of these were middle-class business owners as well as intellectuals and artists. Luckily, Albert Einstein was one of them. He never returned. Now, the lower-class Jews who stayed, unfortunately, couldn't imagine that it was going to get even worse for them. So Sorry about rushing there at the end. We have to keep this under 15 minutes, but that gives you an overview under fascism, and the last two give you an overview on totalitarian rules, and then we will get into how these totalitarian dictatorships and nations eventually led us to the largest war the world has ever seen.